In the heart of a town gripped by fear and superstition, a young woman named Seraphine Wren stood accused of witchcraft, her fate sealed by the gallows. The townsfolk, driven by memories of her mother's execution, were determined to see her hanged at sunrise. But fate had other plans, as the feared gunslinger Joaquin Varillo rode into town, changing the course of Seraphine's life forever. The air was thick with tension and the scent of dust as the townsfolk gathered at the base of Gallows Hill. The scaffold creaked under its own weight, a grim reminder of the dark history that haunted the town. Seraphine stood at the center, her wrists bound with frayed rope, her once soft blue linen dress streaked with dust and dried blood. Her black hair fell in tangled strands over her shoulders, and her bare feet were cut and bruised from the rocks. They had dragged her across, yet she did not cry, did not plead, did not speak. Her silence was her defiance, her strength. The mayor, his face red and mustache twitching, stepped forward. "She poisoned my boy," he bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion, "just like her mother poisoned this land." He looked into her eyes, and she looked back unflinching. There was no fear in her stare, no apology, only the weight of knowing. The preacher read from a leather-bound Bible that trembled in his hands. The wind picked up, tugging at the noose swaying from the gallows. A boy in the crowd threw a rock, striking her in the side. She did not move. Another cried, "Hang her! Let the devil take her!" The noose was lowered, and the deputy stepped up to place it around her neck. She turned her head slowly, her eyes finding the mayor again and locking there. It wasn't hate that filled them, or despair. It was something worse, recognition. He paled. Somewhere a horse whinnied. The sun climbed higher. And still, she said nothing. Not even when the rope slid against her skin, not even when the preacher stopped reading, not even when the crowd went still. She stood above them all, on the very spot where her mother had burned, and waited for them to repeat history. But not one of them, not even the ones who had cheered back then, could meet her eyes anymore. She didn't need to speak to damn them. Her silence was enough. The sun rose slow over Red Rock, spilling gold across Gallows Hill like it meant to bless what had never deserved it. The light touched the scaffold first, new wood hastily nailed into place, already stained with sweat and the memory of fire. The air was quiet, too quiet. A hanging had a way of stealing sound, like even the birds knew to stay away. Seraphine stood on the platform, tall in her silence. The rope looped around her throat was frayed, thick and cruel. Her bare feet trembled on the edge of the creaking plank, but her spine stayed straight, her chin lifted not in defiance, but in finality. Her hands were bound, her dress torn. Dust clung to her skin like a second sentence. The crowd gathered. Below, farmers, blacksmiths, wives holding their children's hands too tight. Some whispered prayers. Others watched with grim curiosity, but none looked her in the eye. Not anymore. The mayor stood front and center, dressed like a man who believed law lived in his coat buttons. His face was carved in stone. In his hand, a crumpled letter of execution, signed, stamped, and wrong. The preacher beside him fumbled over scripture, mouthing verses that had lost their meaning long before the scaffold was built. The deputy moved to the lever. The mayor gave a single nod. The lever creaked, slow and final, then boom! The shot rang out like thunder cracking through glass. The rope above Seraphine's head snapped clean with one impossible strike. The noose fell limp, useless to the dirt below. She dropped, but not far. A black blur swept across the platform. A stallion, jet black and wild-eyed, reared with a shriek, hooves thrashing. On its back, a figure in dark leather leaned low, one arm catching Seraphine mid-fall, pulling her to the saddle with practiced ease. Gasps tore through the crowd. A woman screamed. Somewhere, a child began to cry, but the man in black didn't stop. He turned the stallion sharply, dust flaring under hoof, the sun flashing off a long rifle still smoking from its single shot. Joaquin Varillo. His name rippled through the square like a curse. He was legend, a name once scrawled in every bounty book from Texas to Arizona. Gunslinger, mercenary, grave, and they'd called him the man who never missed. Gone for 3 years. After the bloodbath in El Dorado Ridge, rumored dead, but he wasn't dead. He was here, and he was saving a witch. Bullets followed as Joaquin drove his heels into the horse's sides. The stallion lunged forward, dirt exploding beneath them. The mayor shouted. The preacher dropped his Bible. The deputy fired twice and missed, both. Seraphine clung to his coat, her arms locked tight around him. Her hair streamed behind like smoke. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just held on. They thundered past the gallows, past the chapel, past the stunned townsfolk who'd come to see justice and instead watched a ghost ride into the dawn. Joaquin's coat flared behind him like a shadow set free, the rifle strapped to his back, a pistol. At his hip, the woman in his arms, silent as stone, alive in his grip. By the time the first pass reached their horses, he was already gone. Only hoofprints remained, and the smoke of a broken rope curling in the morning light. They didn't stop riding until the sun was halfway to its peak, and the red rocks had given way to shadowed cliffs, deep in a narrow gorge hidden by tall stone and twisted brush. Joaquin slowed the horse to a halt and swung down, lifting Seraphine gently to the ground. She stumbled but didn't fall. He tied the horse loosely to a tree, eyes scanning the sky. Then he turned to her. Dust clung to her skin. Rope burns ringed. Her throat. Her mouth parted, but no sound came. Of course, he remembered now. She didn't speak. She never had. She reached for a stick, crouched beside a flat patch of dirt, and scratched a single word. Why? Joaquin crouched beside her, his boots creaking. His face was older now, lined, sun-worn, and shadowed by something deeper than time. He looked at the word for a long moment. Then he met her eyes. "Because," he said quietly, "once you found me dying in a creek bed. Bullet in my gut, blood in my mouth." She blinked. Recognition flickered behind her calm expression. "I was no one," he went on. "No name, no worth, just another killer crawling toward the end." He nodded slowly. "And you saved me. No questions, no payment, just a poultice and a fire and eyes that never looked away." His voice dropped. "I never forgot that." She stared at him, then picked up the stick again, scratched out another word. "Deserve." Joaquin gave a bitter laugh. "No, I didn't deserve it then, and I sure as hell don't now." He reached into his coat, pulled out a flask, and handed it to her. "Drink. You're safe for now." She took it with shaking hands, sipped, then looked at him one last time. He shrugged. "I figured I owed you a life." He turned to check the trail. Behind them, the desert wind rose again, curling around the stone like a breath held too long. And for the first time in her life, Seraphine didn't feel alone in the silence. The rocks of the canyon glowed red in the last light of day. But the cave Joaquin found was cool and dark. Hidden by brush and shaped by time, it sank into the earth like the mouth of something ancient and tired. Wind howled low outside, slipping between the cracks like a voice with nowhere else to go. Inside, the air was still, still and waiting. They built a fire with dead wood and caution, careful not to let the smoke climb too high or the flames grow too wild. Joaquin struck the flint in silence, sparks flashing against the shadows like tiny rebellions. When the fire caught, he sat back on his heels, breath low, watching it settle into a low, steady burn. Seraphine sat across from him, her back against the cave wall, legs folded neatly, her hands resting in her lap like she had done this 100 times before. Her skin was streaked with dust, her dress torn at the sleeve, and a dark bruise circled her neck, faint but unforgiving, like the ghost of the noose that had nearly ended her life. Her face, though, remained unreadable, calm, not cold, not warm, just still. Joaquin crouched beside her, his coat brushing the stone. His hands moved carefully, examining the shallow cuts on her arm. They weren't deep, but they bled slow, steady. He pulled a strip of cloth from his saddlebag, wrapped it around her wrist with gentle precision. She didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched all day. She only watched him. That same way she had once watched him dying. Years ago, a different fire had burned in a different place. Back then, he had been younger, harder in the face, wilder in the eyes. The kind of man who rode too fast and slept too light. He remembered the sting of the bullet just under the ribs, how it burned like betrayal and left him crawling through the underbrush, dragging himself across rocks and sand with both hands and teeth gritted. Every breath was fire, every second a threat. He collapsed beside a creek, ribs screaming, the water too far to reach. Darkness crept in. Then movement, small feet. A girl's voice, never raised. She couldn't have been more than 12, thin and sharp-eyed, a wild thing in a ragged dress. She said nothing, not a word, just looked at him with those strange, still eyes, dark and knowing and not afraid. She came back minutes later with herbs wrapped in cloth, a water skin slung over one shoulder. She knelt beside him, brewed something, sharp and bitter, and pressed it to the wound with a touch that hurt just enough to help. He tried to speak. She hushed him without a word. He passed out beneath stars that didn't care, and woke with her still there, dozing lightly beneath a tree, her body curled like a cat ready to spring. She left before dawn, and all he could remember was her eyes. Eyes he saw again yesterday. Only this time she was the one pulling him from the edge. The fire crackled low between them now. Joaquin glanced over. She was watching him again. Always watching. "You were just a kid," he said softly. "And you saved me." She tilted her head. "Maybe. That's why I never could forget you. Eyes like that. They burned through a man." He poked the fire, feeding it a sliver of dry wood. Shadows danced across the stone walls. She reached for her satchel, pulled out a handful of dried leaves, and held them up. He nodded for pain. She nodded once and placed them into a tin of boiling water. As he sat back, his coat shifted open. A piece of folded parchment slipped halfway from the inner pocket. Seraphine's eyes narrowed. She reached out, hesitating. He didn't notice. She took it gently, unfolded it. The firelight illuminated the words, rough and hastily written, "Seraphine Wren, kill clean. $500 paid in advance." She stared at it, a breath caught in her chest. She did not speak, could not, but her hand trembled. Turned just as she looked up, the paper held between two fingers like a verdict. His face changed, just for a second. Then he stood, slow and careful. "Seraphine," he began. She didn't move. Didn't drop the paper, didn't look away. "I didn't come for that," he said. "Not anymore." He stepped forward. "It's old from weeks ago, before I knew who you were." Still nothing from her, only her eyes. He hated that about her. The way she never yelled, never accused, just stared until you saw every crack in yourself reflected back. "I tracked you to that cabin," he said. "Waited for the right time. But the more I watched, the more I remembered." He crouched in front of her, but she stayed silent. "I couldn't do it," he said. "You don't kill someone who saved you, even if the world says you should." He reached out slowly, gently, took the paper from her hand and crumpled it, tossed it into the fire. The flames caught the edge, devoured. The words, he looked back at her. "I owe you everything," he said. "So if you don't believe me, I'll ride out come morning. Won't look back." Still she said nothing, but her shoulders softened just slightly. She poured a cup of the bitter tea and handed it to him. Her fingers brushed his for half a second. He drank. The bitterness was nothing compared to the weight he'd carried into that cave, and maybe, just maybe, it was starting to lift. The desert night fell fast and without mercy. Joaquin and Seraphine moved through the brush like ghosts, keeping low, keeping quiet. The cave had bought them time, but not safety. Joaquin had seen the tracks, boot prints in the sand that did not belong to the sheriff's men. No, these were darker riders, men like he used to ride with, bounty hunters, mercenaries, the kind you sent to finish jobs others failed. And now, they were coming to erase the mistake of letting Seraphine Wren live. They made camp in a dry ravine, shielded by bent trees and broken stone. Joaquin built a small fire hidden under a ridge, just enough to warm their hands. Seraphine had not said a word, not that she ever did, but her eyes watched the darkness like something in it was watching her back. She knew what was coming. He cleaned his rifle in silence, wiping the dust from the barrel, loading each bullet like a prayer. Then he heard it, the whistle of wind that did not belong to wind. Crack! The bullet tore through the air, clipped the ridge, and sent a shower of rock raining down beside them. "Go!" Joaquin growled, grabbing her by the arm. They scrambled from cover, sprinting through. Thorn and dust. Another shot rang out, then another. One caught Joaquin in the shoulder, just a graze, but it spun him sideways, blood warm against his ribs. He stumbled behind a boulder, cursing low, gritting his teeth. Seraphine dropped beside him, her eyes wide. She reached for his coat, yanked it open. Blood soaked through the fabric. He pushed her hands away. "Keep going," he hissed. "They're after you." But she stayed. With calm hands, she pulled out herbs, tore strips from her underskirt, and began to clean the wound. Her touch was firm but careful. Her breath came fast, but her movements didn't shake. When she pressed the cloth against the gash, he flinched, and her hand moved to his cheek. Not for balance, not for instruction, just to stay. Her palm cupped. His face, dirt-smudged and warm. Their eyes met, and in the middle of the pain, the running, the fear, he felt something quiet take root. She didn't look away. Neither did he, but the moment was short-lived. Hoofbeats thundered from the ridge. 3 shadows dropped down on them like wolves. Joaquin reached for his rifle, but it had fallen in the scramble. His knife was tucked in his boot, but not fast. Enough! The first man raised his gun, smirking through a dust-covered face. "Thought you could run, Graven," he spat. "Should have stayed dead." Joaquin stood between them and Seraphine, swaying slightly. "She's got nothing to do with you, boss. Says she's a loose string. You know what we do with loose." Bang! The gunshot split the sentence in half. The man staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. He dropped to the ground like a puppet with cut strings. Joaquin blinked. Ah. Behind him, Seraphine held his revolver, 2 hands steady grip, eyes locked on the second man. The second didn't move fast enough. Bang! His leg gave out and he collapsed with a scream. The third ran. Joaquin turned to her, stunned. She lowered the weapon, smoke curling from the barrel, her face unreadable, but her chest heaving. He took a step toward her slowly. "You just saved my life." She didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply placed the revolver back in his holster and picked up the herbs she'd dropped. Then she knelt beside him again and went back to cleaning his wound. And in that moment, Joaquin realized Seraphine Wren might never speak. But tonight, she had shouted louder than any voice ever could. The desert gave nothing easily, not even shelter. But just before night swallowed the last traces of light, Seraphine found it, a half-buried house of God, long abandoned and cracked by time. The chapel stood crooked on a bluff, its bell long rusted into silence, doors sagging open like a yawn. Too tired to finish, wind whispered through the broken slats of its roof, rattling hymns that had not been sung in decades. Inside, she laid Joaquin on what remained of the altar, the wood scorched and blackened at the edges. He was burning up, his body slick with sweat, the wound on his side red and angry, despite the poultice she had pressed into it. He mumbled in broken fragments, tossing his head from side to side. "Eyes! Those eyes found me in the creek. Thought I was dead. It didn't let me go." Seraphine dampened a cloth in melted snow water and touched it to his forehead. Her fingers moved without hurry, gentle, steady. She had seen this before. Fevers that walked the line between here and not. dragging men into the in-between. But Joaquin was not just any man. He had come back for her. She sat beside him on the cold stone, watching over him as the hours slid past. Her own eyes never closed, not once. Outside, coyotes howled at stars that blinked without warmth. Inside, the only sound was his breathing. Harsh, irregular, alive. Just before dawn, he went still. Not the kind of still that meant peace, the kind that meant absence. Seraphine leaned close, her hand on his chest. Nothing. Then a shallow gasp, then another. His lips parted, his eyes fluttered. Slowly, Joaquin Varillo returned to the world. He blinked against the thin light creeping through the shattered window. For a moment, confusion clouded his face. Then it cleared. He saw her. Seraphine was seated beside him, legs folded under her, hair tangled, face pale. Her hands rested in her lap. But her eyes, those same eyes that had once stared into him at the edge of death, met his with quiet fire. Joaquin tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He coughed weakly. Still here. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She simply reached out and took his hand. Then, slow and certain, she guided it to rest over her heart. Her palm followed. She pressed both their hands against her chest, where the beat was strong, sure, calm. Then she looked into him, deeper than ever before, and gave a single nod. It was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was absolute. Joaquin's breath caught. She had forgiven him, all of it. Not with a word, not with a vow, but with the truth, she, whom carried in her silence. He turned his hand under hers, so their palms pressed together. "Thank you," he rasped. She smiled then, a soft, tired thing, but real. Later, when the sun began to rise over the desert and send gold through the cracks in the chapel roof, they sat side by side on the steps. Joaquin was swaddled in a blanket, a tin cup of tea trembling in his hand. Seraphine leaned against the doorframe, a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes on the far-off ridgeline where the night shadows melted into morning. "I never figured I'd end up here," Joaquin said, voice low. "In a church, no less." She arched a brow. "I know," he muttered. "Hell must be icing over." She chuckled just once, and he looked at her like he had not really seen her until now. "I never told you what I was before all this," he said. She tilted her head, waiting. "I was good at killing," he said. "Too good. It made me rich. Made me empty." He looked down at his hands. "Then one day I bled out in a creek, and a girl with eyes like fire found me and didn't let me die." Seraphine turned to him, solemn. "And now that girl just saved me again." He glanced at her, a slow grin, creeping up. "Starting to think you might be my guardian angel." She rolled her eyes. "But the quiet kind," he added. The mayor stepped out onto the porch, flanked by his deputies. He was thinner now, paler, like the power he carried had begun to weigh on him. "You're trespassing," he said coldly. "There's still a price on her head." "No," Joaquin said, voice like gravel. "Not anymore." He pulled something from his coat, a letter folded and yellowed. The mayor stiffened the moment he saw it. Joaquin unfolded it slowly, reading aloud. "Meet me at the bluff. Bring the girl. She'll keep her mouth shut, or I'll make her." Signed, Nathaniel Crowley. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Seraphine stood still beside the horse, eyes fixed on the mayor. "That's your son's handwriting, ain't it?" Joaquin asked, stepping forward. "The one you said she poisoned?" The mayor said nothing. "She didn't kill him. You covered his sins and blamed her, same as you did to her mother." The mayor's jaw worked. His hand trembled near the pocket where his pistol hid. "She never spoke," Joaquin said. "But maybe that's what scared you most, because she never had to say a word for you to know she saw the truth." The mayor's eyes darted around the crowd. Too many people, too many watching. Too many who'd whispered their own doubts, but had been too scared to speak them. Joaquin dropped the letter at his feet. The mayor bent to pick it up, but before his hand touched the paper, he drew his revolver instead. He turned it not on Joaquin, not on Seraphine, on himself. One breath, one crack, and the man who'd ruled Red Rock through fear fell to the boards, smoke rising from his temple. Silence gripped the street. Seraphine did not move. She didn't gasp, didn't blink. She just stood there, framed by the memory of fire, and let the town look at what they had done. One by one, the townsfolk dropped their eyes. Not in shame, not in apology, just because none of them had the courage to meet hers anymore. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer it either. She just stepped down from the porch, walked past the gallows, and kept moving. And behind her, Red Rock stood still, sober and silent, watching the last witch it had tried to burn walk free, untouched by flame. The land outside Red Rock had never been kind. It was a stretch of sun-baked stone and brittle sagebrush, too dry for weak, too far for law. Wind carved the rocks like old regrets. And the silence at night was the kind that pressed against your chest, like a memory that would not let go. But it was theirs now, claimed not with papers or deeds, but with blood and choice. Where once the gallows stood, they laid it bare. Joaquin tore the beams down himself, plank by plank, with sweat and spit and a curse under every breath. He drove the last nail from the final board and tossed it into the fire. The crackle sounded like the past breaking. Then he took a shovel. He dug. For days, blistered hands, raw shoulders, cracked lips, the earth fought him. Rocks clanged against steel, sand caved in, but he kept going. Seraphine brought him water, pressed cool cloths to his neck, laid herbs in the soil where the sun hit hardest. And when the first bucket came up cold and clear, she knelt beside the well, placed her hand on the damp earth, and closed her eyes like she was listening, like she was praying. Around the well, she planted wildflowers. Desert marigold, Indian, paintbrush, a few stubborn green things whose names no one knew. She whispered to the dirt and tended each shoot with water and ash and quiet. The town still whispered. Of course they did. But no one came near. They didn't want to test if what they feared was real. Seraphine and Joaquin built a cabin from salvaged boards and scorched timbers. It stood low and sturdy beneath a rock ledge that broke the wind. She dried herbs by the windows. He mended saddles by the door. A horse grazed the nearby ridge. The air smelled of smoke and lavender. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and set the dust, to glow, a rider came. He was young, broad-shouldered, sun-worn like most who wandered west looking for something they'd only read about in stories. He rode up slow, hat in hand, horse foaming at the bit. He nodded at Joaquin, who was sitting on the porch shaping leather with a dull awl. The rider glanced toward the garden, where Seraphine knelt with a trowel and a bundle of lavender, the light. "Who catching in her hair? She the one they tried to hang?" he asked. "The witch?" Joaquin didn't look up. "No," he said. "She's the one who didn't have to speak to make the whole town afraid." The rider squinted. "She really never talks?" Joaquin wiped. His hands on a rag stood and looked towards Seraphine. She turned, met his eyes, a small tilt of her chin. A quiet moment shared. "She talks plenty," Joaquin said. "Just not the way most folks listen." The rider left before sundown, quieter than he'd come. That night, Joaquin and Seraphine sat together, on the porch. The sky blushed violet. The breeze stirred the flowers in slow waves. A coyote howled far off, but the night was otherwise still. Seraphine leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, his thumb brushing slow. Circles against the back of her hand. He looked down at that hand, the one that had once steadied his fevered breath, the one that had gripped a gun to save his life, the one that had coaxed wildflowers from ground soaked in history and death. And he smiled. She was silence made. Flesh, he would one day say to a child, maybe his own, asking where their story began. And he was the only one who ever listened long enough to hear her silence say yes. If this story stirred something deep inside you, the silence that spoke, louder than bullets, the kind of love that does not need words, then you've just felt the heartbeat of Wild West love stories. Subscribe to the channel for more tales where love defies guns, prejudice, and the harshest deserts. Stories of forbidden glances, impossible choices, and hearts that survive what the law never could. We ride through dust and danger every week. Come with us. This is Wild West Love Stories, where bullets miss but hearts do not. Hit that subscribe button and stay for the next story.